I'm Glenn Wood.
And I'm Richard Tadamir.
We're psychotherapists based out of British Columbia, Canada, and you're listening to Deliberating Practice.
In this podcast, we deconstruct everything from the foundations of therapy to its newest innovations and horizons.
We take a critical perspective on contemporary issues that affect therapists across the world. We share our own stories, both personal and professional, and sometimes we talk to other therapists too.
We hope that this podcast can be like sitting with the trusted mentor you always wish you had, helping you integrate and make sense of our complex and exciting field.
So sit back, relax, and enjoy the episode. For resources, show notes, and to work with Richard or Glenn for supervision, consulting, or counseling, go to deliberatingpractice.com. Welcome to the Deliberating Practice Podcast. I am your host, Glenn Wood, joined as always by your other host, Richard Tadamir. And this morning we have a special guest with us for this episode, Avraham Cohen. Richard, do you want to introduce Avraham to our listeners a little bit?
I will give a start, and then I'm sure Avraham can fill in. So Avraham is a therapist in the Vancouver area. He has taught at multiple universities in the area. He is Jewish background, Buddhist. Philosophy is, I think, integrated into his way of caring, at least in my experience. I'll let you maybe talk a little bit about yourself. You've worked a lot with youth, as that's something we share in common, and families, and from a very systemic kind of relational perspective.
Well, first of all, when you said I'm a Buddhist, I recalled a meeting when I was at UBC. Michael Mahoney, I don't know if you know who he was, came as a guest, basically a lecturer, and he was in the counseling department. I was in the education zone. So I had to fight my way in to hear this meeting I was having. So inclusivity didn't seem to be part of the whole program with the counseling people. But I did get in, and somebody asked him what it was like to be a structuralist. And he said the following. He says, I really don't like to think of myself as any kind of ist. So I do not, I like that. I don't think of myself as any kind of ist.
Appreciate that.
Yeah. And then you said something else, and I was going to comment on it, and I forgot what it was. So.
Well, maybe in your own words, Avraham, we could hear a little bit about your background and who you are as a therapist and educator.
Okay, well, I'll try and give you the medium-sized version, tending towards the short one, because otherwise we could hear my whole life story. Well, I think my whole life I've always been curious about myself and about people. And I was surprisingly stunned and shocked to find out that I could actually perhaps get paid to have this interest with people. And so, and then I may have said this to you before, but I thought I had to be a psychiatrist, and I knew to be a psychiatrist, I had to be a doctor, which meant I had to be pretty well versed in science, which was not my favorite subject. I had some curiosity about it, but when I got to UBC and found myself, you could say, mistakenly enrolled in first-year chemistry, I thought, man, this is really boring. And then, of course, obviously not for other people. And on top of that, we had labs where we had Bunsen burners in those days. I was quite sure I was going to light myself on fire. So it was a terrorizing experience. And needless to say, I didn't do very well in Chemistry 101. But eventually I found out that my curiosity was still alive about people, but I didn't really know what to do with it. I mean, I spent more time in the coffee shop at UBC in my undergraduate years than in classes, which showed up. My grades were not exactly outstanding, and I had been a very outstanding student in my early years in K-6 and high school, but nobody had prepared me. I was the first member of my family to go to university, and my parents were quite keen that I could go to university, but they couldn't tell me anything, and I didn't know anything. So I wound up in taking things I had no idea what for, although I do recall my very first philosophy class, and the professor was Barnett Savory, who was the head of the department. He showed up in one of these duster coats, because in those days it was chalkboard, and so he had written on the board, is it better to be a happy pig or an unhappy Aristotle? And I thought, gee, what a great question. Who's Aristotle? I had no idea. But I thought, better to be an unhappy Aristotle because I would be thinking about life. But being a happy pig wasn't totally unappealing. So I think subsequently I've tried to do some of both, although I'm more fond of dogs than pigs, much more. So in Philosophy 100, we studied Plato's Republic, which some people see as kind of a very authoritarian kind of model. But to me at the time, it made great sense. The tripartite society, the philosopher kings, the artisans, and the warriors. And as time has gone by, I thought, well, every one of us can be a philosopher king in our own way. We can be an artisan, certain things we're good at and are needed, and a warrior. And so to that end, I was very fascinated with martial arts, and I studied a number of them, but none of them really suited me that well. I did karate, and I thought, what if somebody hits me? Well, that's not a good attitude. But, I was taught how to block and things. But eventually I discovered Aikido, the Japanese martial art, developed by Morihei Ueshiba O-sensei. And he had the idea that Japan had something wrong. This was, after the Second World War. And he had studied martial arts for years. And prior to that, he'd been quite ill. And so I'd had a lot of illness myself as a child. And so there was something I was trying to heal, although I wasn't too clear about how I was going to do that. I mean, I had doctors and they were using medicine and stuff like that. So, but his great line was, the purpose of the defense is not to defeat your attacker, but to change the heart of your attacker. And I thought, that's brilliant. And of course, not easily done, but the whole art of Aikido is key energy and moving with the energy and developing your access to that energy to the maximum level possible. Now, the particular Aikido I studied was called Ki Aikido, so the emphasis on the ki energy was very strong. But we did learn all the moves, and we learned how to take ukemi, the falls. And I must admit, the first time I did a forward break fall, I thought I'm going to break my neck and I'll wind up a paraplegic or quadriplegic. Anyway, I learned how to do it. I was quite impressed with myself. And so I studied, and I was probably one of the slowest students, but I did eventually achieve first Dan black belt, so I was quite impressed. I have the belt still sitting up there on my shelf, so that was exciting. And what's important, like I don't practice anymore. In fact, the people I practice was stopped during COVID, and it never got reestablished. But also I feel for me to take a fall now, I'd be a little concerned about my fragility. But what stays with me is the spirit of Aikido, the philosophy, the ability to really be with people in the right way at each moment. And it's not manipulative, it's just sensing and being with. This also fits with my ongoing, quite long interest in Taoism, which is about finding, following nature, but it's not about following trees or the sky. It's about finding your own nature, and actually it's refining it. If you look at small children, they don't have to look for it, it's already there. But we learn how to cover it up and protect ourselves and not have people be mad with us or shun us. And so, like, we had a 2-year-old over here last night, our grandchild, and she's like everything, she's just busy. If she doesn't like something, you don't have to wonder what it is. If she likes it, she'll let you know. So I was fortunate. I was quite disturbed in my late teens, early 20s, maybe my whole life. And so my parents kept saying, well, we could send you to a psychiatrist. So I thought, well, that's for crazy people. But eventually I succumbed, and I went to see this psychiatrist, Dr. Earl Harden, who was the best find I could have had. He was incredibly warm, friendly, acknowledging, and I knew for sure every time I saw Dr. Harden, I would feel good for about 3 days. And then I couldn't wait till the next session. And so I thought, boy, I'd love to do that. And then he started a group, and one of the women that was in the group talked about this job possibility. So I pursued it. It turned out to be working with adolescents, as you alluded to earlier, and with Dr. Peter Lavelle, an Irish psychiatrist, who felt that psychiatry didn't have that much to offer adolescents. And on top of that, it was right in the heart of the human potential movement period. And so he was very interested in that. And Fritz Perls, the founder of Gestalt therapy, was actually living at Lake Cowichan at the time. And I did manage to see him in person a few times. Just like his books, he barely made any sense, but his energy was incredible. I remember he spoke out at UBC once in this great big room in the Student Union building. And he gave a talk. I could not tell you one thing he said. But at the end, the students they were so ecstatic about him. And he went like this. He said, I can feel the waves of love. And he was moving like this. And I thought there's something very alive there. And perhaps you know that he was a student of Freud's, and he thought that psychoanalysis was what he called, I forget it, he had 3 levels, chicken shit, bullshit, and elephant shit. And I'm not sure which one he thought it was, but he thought it was way too much head talk. And so he developed something that was very alive, and I was fortunate to be exposed to some people that were actually brought to us. David Berg, who was a philosophy professor out at SFU, studied with Fritz. David was a pretty cantankerous kind of guy. He had a falling out with Fritz, which wouldn't be surprising. But he was incredible. He was one of the smartest people I've ever met. I remember being in a group with him, and I asked some question that I thought was pretty clever. Now, I'm sure David's IQ was probably double mine. He paused for a second. He says, I can't really answer that. He says, you're way too smart for me. I thought, I'm way too smart for him? I don't think so. But I took the message that I was really in my head thinking too much. And so I pursued all kinds of therapies after that for myself and to study. Body-oriented therapies really interested me. Transactional analysis, Reichian work, which is a body therapy. And also I was exposed, of course, to Carl Rogers, and I thought this idea of unconditional love, I didn't really think too critically about that, but I thought, well, is it possible to unconditionally love? What does it mean? It's certainly not a cognitive concept. I've been thinking about that the rest of my life, and I still have thoughts, and maybe you want to ask me about that at some point, or I'd like to hear what you think about it too. So anyway, I eventually worked with adolescents. I developed a whole model of how to run one of the treatment resources, which I was allowed to do. So the idea of developing a community of therapists, the counselors, who were engaged with each other in the way people are rarely engaged anywhere, but particularly in places where they're supposed to work. I was able to do that. And Peter only worked there for 2 years. He said any organization will turn into an institution within 2 years, and he left after 2 years. So he was on campus there. It was Burnaby Mental Health, and I ran into him. He was there for something. And so I invited him up, and he looked around, and he says, well, you've taken what I was doing a lot farther. Well, could I get a better compliment? Absolutely not. And so part of my PhD was writing about that, but also not just about that experience, but the whole idea of the humanistic existential process-oriented approaches in therapy and with adolescents. I'll tell you this brief story. There was 3 units like similar in terms of their, number of kids, number of staff, professional psychiatrists involved, all that. A woman came one day, a social worker, who was going to, it was about one of her kids that we had. So it was in the morning. I said, we're just about to have a community meeting. Would you like to sit in the meeting? She said she did. And so she sat in, and it was an hour. And then we went back in the office afterwards. And the rumor in the place was our kids were the least disturbed. But the truth is we had a murderer and a child molester and a fire starter, 3 kids with psychotic diagnosis, so-called, and then all kinds of other stuff, 12 kids altogether. Anyway, she came into the office, and I said, what'd you think? She says, well, I wish the staff where I work could communicate as well as your kids. And I thought that showed a lot of what's possible. And we did a lot with some very disturbed kids, but there's a flaw in the system. They needed the enclosure that we provided and the community, and as soon as they were discharged, many of them fell backwards, because there was not the community support. Same with a lot of addiction centers. A friend of mine used to work at a fairly well-known center, and he said, so people would have incredible success, but on the way home, after they were discharged, they would stop at the bar or go downtown and get whatever drug. So it's coming back into the world that we live in. They're not prepared for it. I don't know if any of us are really prepared for it, but we have better coping skills or strategies. Well, I'll stop there. same. I'm sure I'm leaving out some big pieces, but maybe they'll come to me as we go along.
Yeah. Well, I think it would be good to know more, Avraham, about you as a therapist. Like,
Mm-hmm.
just understand a little bit more about, like you've spoken about your origins, which is really great at the Maples, which I think a lot of our listeners will be familiar about or familiar to as an
Mm-hmm.
institution. But, obviously at some point you moved into private practice and kind of found your way in the arena of psychotherapy. And so I think, we're curious to know what that was like and, who you drew on and what influenced you in the direction of becoming a psychotherapist.
Okay, well, another question with lots of pieces of answer. I'll try and well, I really summarize. I trust that whatever's coming out covers the waterfront. So I'm cultivating my Taoist self, the inner nature, and let it come out. So what I am convinced of, and of course I'm not the first person to think of this, there's something in us when we're born. You could call it spirit, soul, basic nature. And my wife tells me, and I'm seeing it actually now, that when a child is born, you can already see things. They're not a blank slate, as I forget who it was that wrote about blank slates. And I think the famous behaviorist, name's escaping me, but basically he raised his children that way. Behavioral concepts, the children were they grew up
Skinner.
really messed up.
Skinner and Watson, yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Skinner and Watson. And so what I believe is this nature is there. And as soon as we're born almost, it begins to be impacted. But you can't, babies, they either cry or they laugh or they pee or poop or whatever, but they can't possibly talk to you about it. Their brains haven't got that type of development. But the influencers are there. A particular period, when children get to around 2. Do you have children, Glenn?
No.
No, okay. But you've probably seen it. Around 2, children learn they can say no, and they will say no.
Oh, yeah.
And parents are disturbed by this. My child is misbehaving, is being difficult. So they punish them, not necessarily harshly, although at times, but they try and get them not to say no. Well, it's a stage where they're just asserting themselves. They're learning what their power is in the world. And so I remember studying this and thinking, well, this makes sense, but I've actually seen it. And I have clients who are basically shut down from early days with the best of intentions. It's easy to blame parents, but I believe even the worst parent is doing the best they can. Unfortunately, that best is often very destructive. And of course, there's no doubt about it. Parents that are like that had parents too, and grandparents of their parents. And so it's a multi-generational problem. And I think that's in the microcosm of families, but I see it in the world level as well. It's like if we look at what's going on in the world now, like in the Ukraine or particularly the Middle East, they don't have the ability to discuss. And one of the things I've learned is even discussion is kind of falls short, but people can come to agreements that they will stick to. Or not. What I see now is lying it's not lying anymore. It's just an alternative truth. I watch, sometimes I like to turn on Fox to see what the other side is thinking, and I see the problem is their sides, and they don't have a way of listening to each other. And so the same events have a very different perspective. But this goes to education, and what I was interested in talking about when I did my PhD is the ability to see beyond expressing my view and believing it's the truth and seeing the whole picture. All the views doesn't mean I'm wishy-washy. I have values that I follow, like I believe that we ought to preserve life. We ought to look after people. And I think that's a good question is it really important if people stay alive? Does it matter? I forget who it was that said this great thing that really appealed to me. If one person is killed, it's a tragedy. If thousands of people are killed, it's a statistic. And I think when we watch the news, or many of us, it's like, oh man, so they killed 60,000 people. That's a lot of people, I think. If I believe if I was to really let that in, I'd be done. I wouldn't even be able to walk around, nor would anybody else. But I think we can learn to be a bit more tuned to the realities of the world and to see that we are living the very thing that we see in the world in our own little microcosms. Have a fight with a friend, with a partner, or a wife, a husband. We don't shoot them, but we shoot them with words or withdrawals or tone, lack of attention, too much attention, all kinds of things going on. So I think there's layers. I think it's worth seeing it that way because it gives perspective. I'm sure you've both seen this. Clients talking to you as if they're the only person that's ever had whatever problem they have. The details may be a little different, but the pattern is phenomenally repetitive.
Mm-hmm.
And so the ability to see patterns, I think, is important. The other thing in terms of my work, I think Freud is dismissed a lot, and for some reason, he was of his time, but the idea of the unconscious and the transference and countertransference, those things take place all the time. I remember waking up a few years ago one day when I thought a client was being a little not great, not reliable. And I took it personally. I thought, what am I talking about? I'm sure. In fact, they've told me they basically do the same thing with everybody, and I'm not special. And so for people to see that anybody that's doing something they don't like, it hits them, but it's not aimed at them. It's just aimed at anybody that comes in and pushes the right button. And so part of what I'm interested in my work, actually, I forgot to mention one of my perhaps my greatest teacher was Dr. Arnold Mindell, who sadly just died this year in June, I think. But he developed process work. I don't know, I'll just tell you briefly the story about Arnold Mindell. He was a physicist. He was studying physics, and apparently he was Nobel-level physicist. And he went to Zurich to study physics. And he used to go for coffee every Sunday at this particular coffee shop. And he eventually ran into somebody there, and they would collide every Sunday and talk to each other. He didn't even know the person's name, but eventually found out it was Jung's nephew. And he became very interested in he had body symptoms, and he was very interested in those body symptoms. So he stopped being a physicist and became a Jungian analyst, a very popular one, and he was a great teacher. And part of analytic training is you do your own analysis, sometimes for years. And one of the things I like about the Jungians is they believe analysis is very long term. And I think it's not about curing problems. It's about becoming increasingly more of who you are. And I think Jung was on to that. But I think Arnie Mindell was more on to that. And maybe I'm even at least as much as Arnie, if not more convinced of that. We're trying to become who we are. But it's a bit like if a tree is growing and it kind of gets intercepted and starts to bend this way and then back this way. If you try and straighten the tree, you're going to break it. So you're trying to reshape things, reshape the flow, all that. But I think humans are a little more flexible than trees. And so it's possible. I grew up being very self-critical, which seems to be a very common malady in these days, except for the people that are very other critical and they think it's all everybody else. And we all have both of that in us. And so self-critical person has, you could say, two dissociated parts. The part that's being criticized and the part that is criticizing. And most people are identified with one side or the other. If it's identification with the critic, they don't really think I'm a critic. I'm just telling the truth. And people can't take it. If I'm being criticized, it's like, it's not fair. So the thing is, the part that we want to get rid of, people say, I've got to stop being so self-critical or critical of others or whatever, or I've got to be less aggressive, or some people think they should be more aggressive. But the view I have, and this comes from Gestalt therapy, from Arnie Mindell, from my own ideas, even from Jung, if I have a part that I want to get rid of, that's a bad idea, getting rid of it. It's arrested development. And if you look at people that are kind of losing it, I like to ask clients, because they'll be complaining about their narcissistic, usually boyfriend, but sometimes a girlfriend or wife or husband. If that person, how old would this person have to be for that to be okay? Often they'll say like 15 or 14. I say, no, how about 2 or 3? So they'll agree with me. I say they've never developed under certain conditions beyond the age of 2 or 3. And so if you've got a 2-year-old that's in a grown-up body, it's an art to be able to talk to them and help them to grow beyond the state they're in. And so I believe that there's a lot of, like if you think about it, an internal critic or an external critic, critics are trying to help people. Their skill level is, you could say, a little less than optimal. So, you're being such an idiot. You should stop doing that. Gee, I feel like, thanks for helping me. Let's do something else. But if it's put in a way like, if it's addressing the person in a way that helps them to grow beyond that. And like I was talking about the children learning to say no at about age 2. If they're arrested there, if they're stopped, they never learn. They either become very passive or very aggressive, but they're usually stuck in one mode or the other. And so there's something that needs to grow there. And so the beauty of all these problems, there's some gold in there. Talked about the alchemy of our growth. And so this is the alchemy. You have to cook the material long enough at the right temperature and the therapist has to have the right attitude, and things can start to emerge. But this idea of fixing it quickly, you might have a moment where I'm just enlightened for a minute or two, but it doesn't hold. I think what I'm looking for, how can people become so natural with themselves and the way the world is that it just comes easily. But it's not easy to do that. I'm kind of pissed about the fact that we only live to be 80 or 90 or even 100. It's not enough time.
I think, what I'm just thinking about as I'm listening to you talk is how different your frame of reference and understanding of psychotherapy is compared to someone from the sort of contemporary era that, as you're making reference to the theories that informed your practice and orientation throughout your career, psychoanalysis, Gestalt psychotherapy, the humanistic movement. I just think about how remote those are in like the contemporary era, how little attention is paid to these, I think, really interesting and creative and, nonetheless influential orientations, right? And so that, it's very interesting to me. Like, I guess where my mind is going is just kind of towards the narrowness of psychotherapy nowadays, right? Like with the evidence-based movement and, empirically validated therapies, and sort of like this sort of like contemporary eclecticism that we have that's like revolves around trauma, that like there's some of this, what you're saying, may be embedded in some of the orientations, but like I'm getting the sense that when you were studying psychotherapy, and throughout your career, that it was a much wider field and that there was a lot more space for people to be creative and to explore different ways to engage people around their problems than there is now. So I just wonder what you think about that. Like, do you think about, first of all, the first question would be like, do you think about or encounter the kind of narrowness that I'm talking about, like in sort of contemporary psychotherapy? And if you do, like, what are your thoughts and feelings around that, I guess? Yeah.
Well, needless to say, Glenn, I've thought about this a lot. I've run into the brick walls.
That's why we have you on here, Avraham.
We all do.
What's that? Sorry, what's that?
I said that's why we got you on here, right? Is to help us out, right? Sorry,
okay.
Richard.
Well, it's okay. I'm not in a position now where I run into this because, when I worked at the Maples, even at some point they start to bring in psychiatrists. Fortunately, most of them were a bit malleable, so they were willing to work with us. But eventually the Forensic Psychiatric Commission was brought in to run the place. That was the end. I mean, they thought they knew everything. And they thought this was an amazing place, and they were sure that we didn't have disturbed kids. The problem with the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, it does point to things, but if you think about it, and they refer to it almost like it's a Bible or science, but there's no science there at all. How did they decide on the categories? They have committees that meet and they kind of vote. Okay, this many behaviors, this many thoughts for this long, and that means, okay, they get this label. And then even worse is once the label is developed, people refer to people as that label. My manic depressive. They're not a person, they're a manic depressive or a bipolar. And so I think if it was used just to point, it has some use. If somebody says to you, this person is borderline, you know what they're talking about. But the problem is most people say, my borderline client. And so they're no longer a human being. I mean, I've worked with people that had that label. They're extreme, no question. But they're not their label. And working with them is very hard because they're often quite hypervigilant, so they see all kinds of things, but they don't have time. They're panicking all the time. They're so used to panicking, they don't even look like they're panicking, but they jump all over the place. So I've run into that problem for sure with people. Even places I taught, I got in trouble for not towing the party line. I wasn't teaching like everybody else.
Thank God.
Well, thank God. Yeah. I had a great experience. I won't name where, but eventually the management changed and I was told I was not to teach these things. I was not to teach in that way. So that was, but you know what? Something's wrong with me. I don't hold grudges. I should. Maybe I can learn how. Like, as I had many years of doing what I wanted to do, but it was teaching in the way I'm talking. But I did, I had textbooks. I work with students. It's not like I just was teaching the Avraham Cohen method. I
Mhm.
exposed them to all kinds of. Anyway, I don't want to go in big detail about that.
I've got another question for you though, Abraham, which is like,
Yeah.
what is your sense of the like you're speaking of like the medicalization of psychotherapy or and of
Hmm.
mental illness, like
Hmm.
there I go say mental illness, but like of human suffering, right? Like which we would say is like part of this sort of narrowing of the field, right? But it's like
Hmm.
what are your thoughts on why that happened? Like, do you have a sense of why that
Oh,
came
yes,
to
I love
be?
that question.
Many thoughts,
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
usual. So, first is certain of us tend to think in certain ways. First of all, what I call psychological minded, it's not exactly rampant in society. And I'm convinced it's kind of a talent, but everybody can have some of this. But I think what people are looking for is something simple. I remember when I was a kid, if I was sick, I wanted to go to the doctor because he would tell me what was wrong with me and then I would feel better knowing the name of it. And I think that exists in people. And so part of the medicalization you're referring to, Glenn, is medication. Oh, you've got serotonin, this or that, so we'll give you this pill that will adjust that and you'll be better. Maybe I'm not debating that it helps people feel better. And maybe they function better. In fact, almost certainly a lot of them do. But what they don't do is find out anything about who they are, or not much, and they don't become a whole human being. They become a better, I was about to say the word robot, but that's a little bit too extreme.
Oh, no,
But,
that's not. I was thinking
okay,
product. So,
yes.
But I think but you're speaking to a certain kind of like complexity. I think you're saying that like
Yeah.
there is a complexity to this work. There is a complexity to people, which makes
Mhm.
the work of psychotherapy, I think, kind of challenging and exciting. But you're saying like for some people, the majority of people, just in general, there's a kind of shying away from that complexity, or like it can be hard to engage with that complexity. Am I understanding that right?
Totally.
Yeah.
And I tell you, I can relate to it.
Mhm.
When it comes to complexity of people, I'm fascinated. But if I have to fix something in my house, the instructions will defeat me usually. And I want somebody else to do it.
Right. Right.
But I recognize it's me. I don't have the talent for it, and I'm not interested in pushing my limits. So if I can hire somebody to fix my toilet, I prefer it.
Hmm.
But yeah, the truth is human beings are in some ways very much the same at a certain level, but when you go a little wider view or a little deeper view, very complicated, very different. And so for great therapists, you need to very good therapists need to be willing to understand all that. But I believe it's not just the therapist. I think we're trying to help our clients to understand their own complexity and the complexity of other people and the unreality of complaining about their partner who doesn't get it and keeps making these bad choices. I like to say, I wish they were aware they were making any choice at all. They're not. They're just doing what they're used to. Does that answer your question or did I miss the
No,
point?
no, it sure does. Yeah.
Mm.
Like again, like the idea of complexity as an interfering factor, or like not an interfering factor, but just that there is a kind of complexity to this, which maybe can be overwhelming at times. And
Mm.
so there's this attempt to simplify it, right? Like to make it more workable. And one way we can understand that attempt is through medicalizing things, right?
Yeah,
Yeah. When we medicalize things, we're sort of rendering something complex into something simpler and more manageable. If we think about a person's depression, for instance, just as a function of their person, as an expression of like a complicated dynamic within them, right? It could take a while to sort that out. Like it could take a while to really help them, and it might involve like it could just be very difficult. It might involve sort of like engaging with something that's very hard. But if we medicalize it, like even if nothing about it has actually changed in medicalizing it, we feel better. Like, oh, now it's
totally.
something quite simple, right? Like now we can just medicate it, or provide a short course therapy that is sort of technique oriented, and that'll make it better, right? So.
I
well, and
think
I think
that's
we have
very
to mention the intersection with capitalism as
Mhm.
well, right? There is this focus of how do we return the soldier to the battlefield or the worker to the assembly line or computer screen
Wow.
as quickly as possible. So complexity is kind of antithetical to the purpose of capitalism,
That's
in my
brilliant.
view.
I like what both of you are saying. Really nicely put, in my view.
Oh, thank you. I take that compliment highly, Avraham. I very much respect you. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Well, it's actually very helpful for me, Richard, because I've been thinking of ways to put this, and you put it just very succinctly and very clearly. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I just want to say a word about depression also.
Please.
I think it's confused with grief and sadness. True depression, I think, is not it happens, but it's rare. I had a woman a number of years ago told me she was diagnosed with depression. So I said, well, tell me, do you feel anything? She says, no. I said, really? I said, tell me what you feel in your body. She says, nothing. I said, actually nothing, or are you relaxed? She says, I don't feel anything. I'm numb. To me, that's depression. There's a huge physiological shutdown that's gone on. I think it's quite rare. And I think lots of people are put on antidepressants because they're unhappy, they're grieving. I had a woman also who came to see me, and her doctor had put her on antidepressants because she was still depressed 3 months after her husband of 40 years had died. He thought that was too long. And so he was going to get her out of it. So there's a lot of crazy things going on. But of course, that's my view. The doctor will tell you, if you discuss me with him, he'll say that Cohen is a pretty crazy guy. He's got these weird ideas. And I do. I am crazy. I've got weird ideas, and I'm happy for it. It's got me in trouble, of course.
But I think that's a big part of why we wanted to engage with you, Avraham, is because your ideas break from a certain kind of convention, which is like stultifying. Like I think that's the ultimate aim of the project of deliberating practice, is to try to break from this, again, we're talking about this narrowness, right? Like your weird ideas they're just unconventional, but they're pregnant with it, like possibilities that are not available in the conventional space of psychotherapy. I want to get more of your thoughts on that, though. Like, I guess, I mean, because like Richard and I, we have sort of like, and we kind of talked about this in our prep, all three of us, like we have a kind of parlance that's maybe drawn from a more contemporary frame around psychotherapy, whereas I think you have a more classic orientation, right? But I think that there is like a common space of understanding that we share around the problems in psychotherapy. And I mean, you said it so nicely with the medicalization of human suffering as one of them, but I do want to hear more about like what you think, like if we start to turn our minds now to like the space of psychotherapy and what the problems in it are, if you have thoughts about that, Avraham, like if you're thinking about where psychotherapy maybe causes harm or leads people astray or is just ineffective, and then ways we might be able to try to rectify that, or what we need to understand to be able to practice in a way that's more ethical or more consistent with a humanitarian ethos, right? Like, does that make sense?
I'm curious. So you reference a difference between me and perhaps the two of you, which I'm more classical. I would say I'm drawing on those things. But maybe there's something you're referring to that you are tuned into that I'm either not tuned into or I'm not mentioning. So I'd be curious to know what that is.
I think it's like, yeah, and that's fair. And I don't want to be making assumptions, because I'm sure like maybe I am, like maybe actually you're well, but I think like Richard and I, like we're like where we're rooting our orientation more, especially around this project, is in the field of critical psychotherapy. That there is a small emerging field. It's primarily situated in like England or Great Britain, but there are like American and Canadian, North American theorists as well, and theorists in other areas that are sort of leveraging this sort of critique of psychotherapy, right? And they draw on critical theory, they draw on like psychoanalysis, they draw on like feminism and gender studies and things like that. And these are sort of more contemporary, and so I think sometimes sociological ways of understanding. But I think that like there's huge parallels between that and I think what I'm saying, like when I say the more classical, like I'm talking about your humanistic roots, right? Like that there's like I think within humanism there are critical potentials as well, right? Like and we actually, like in contemporary critical psychotherapy, we don't always hear from humanists, right? Like, but they're there, right? But like, and I think again there's these, so I think that's what I'm talking about, is like there is, and I don't know if you're in touch with that, but there is sort of this body of, it's a small body, like it's not a ton there, but critical psychotherapists who are Yeah.
I want to understand is I actually have never heard this term, critical
Right. Yeah.
psychotherapy. So
Right.
I'd like to understand that.
Yeah.
And as soon as I hear critical, of course, I know it's not meant to mean criticism.
Hmm.
It's thinking about it,
That's right.
evaluating.
That's right.
So I'd like to know a bit more about that so I can
Mhm.
respond, but also because I'm curious. And also, I want to know, how does it inform your actual practice of therapy?
Well, I'll speak for myself first, and then Richard, maybe you can say some things too. So I guess my understanding of critical psychotherapy is it's not really it's not a unified discipline around like a set like a one thinker or a number of thinkers, but it's sort of like a hodgepodge of a number of different thinkers who are all grappling with what they feel are problems in the space of psychotherapy, right? Like there's something happening in psychotherapy which they understand to be harmful or unethical or ineffective that needs attention, right? That needs to be sort of elucidated. And there'd be a kind of deconstruction that needs to happen in psychotherapy. Somehow the way psychotherapy has been constructed, it has these problems in it, right? And so how do we deconstruct it in a way that, I don't want to say eliminates these problems, but deconstruct and reconstruct psychotherapy in a way that shifts these issues. And so there's like, when I think about the theorists that we've started to engage with more, the big one is Del Lowenthal, who is a psychotherapist out of England, and he compiled the book on critical psychotherapy. So when there's sort of like a manual, a compilation of articles from a number of thinkers on critical psychotherapy, and Dell was responsible for compiling that. And then other big ones would be Colin Feltham, who is if I remember, Colin Feltham previously worked as a psychotherapist. He doesn't now, but he I believe it was either him or Ian Parker, but one of them. But that's the other person I was going to mention, Colin Feltham and Ian Parker. But I think they're both in England as well, and are practicing psychotherapists that have sort of cultivated their own critical position in psychotherapy. A lot of the critiques or concerns of contemporary psychotherapy today from the critical perspective sort of revolve around the intersection of psychotherapy with like a neoliberal political ideology, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think that's how Richard and I are kind of relating to critical psychotherapy and these discussions, is that and why we find critical psychotherapy valuable is that there is kind of like a neoliberal political ideology that structures a certain kind of subjectivity in people.
Mm-hmm.
And it's that subjectivity itself which causes harm. But when psychotherapy becomes wedded with the project of neoliberal ideology, it actually maintains and sustains and reproduces that subjectivity. And so psychotherapy doesn't break, it actually supports a certain kind of problem.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't treat it. Am I making sense, Avraham, when I say that?
Totally. Suddenly I get it.
Yeah.
Basically preparing people to fit into the system.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Be a good cogs in the machine.
Yeah, that's well said. Richard, do you want to say a little about your experience around this?
Sorry, I was thinking liberation psychology as well.
Mm-hmm.
I did a master's project on the differences between the alternative and mainstream school system, which we were really informed by participatory action research. So the youth actually being participant researchers with us and recruiting and interviewing their fellow youth. And this is coming a lot from Paulo Freire in Latin America and around the theater of the oppressed. I also think about Bell Hooks and her kind of view of Black feminism, anti-oppressive kind of frameworks, queer frameworks as well. So there's a lot of different, as you mentioned, a lot of different thinkers in taking beyond just psychology into sociology, maybe even anthropology, many other areas that I think are just adding additional ways to help maybe create a really solid criticism of some of the problems where capitalism and colonialism has co-opted modern psychotherapy.
So shall I respond?
Mm-hmm. Please.
Everything you both said is completely in my vocabulary, but I don't have that quite the same language. And I also try to be realistic. Most of my clients, and I imagine most of yours, they're in the system. They're trying to survive.
Yes.
And
yes, 100%.
The biggest thing I do in particular is with therapists that come to see me for supervision that are working in organizations. I'm subtly or not so subtly advising them they need to get out of the organization and open private practice because the system will not change. Now, the worst ones in some ways are the best ones. They actually are in a good organization, which is so rare you can hardly find it. But they're actually looked after, they're encouraged and all that, but they're still stuck with a lot of administration and a lot of details. They all they hate it, but they have to do it, and they will do it. And they get paid less than we do per hour for sure. But again, pay isn't the only criteria. To me, it is liberation for me to be in private practice. I miss teaching. I love teaching, but I must say the complexity now of, I hate to say this, in fact, I'm hesitant to say, but all the gender issues and the race issues and social justice, these are, to me, are reified identities. It's like
Identity politics.
I'm anti-oppressive. That's who I am. Well, really? What about the part of you that oppresses people with your anti-oppression?
Well said. Well said. Yeah.
So I think I kind of incorporate all that without even mentioning, but you didn't, one thing neither of you has said is, how do you bring this in with your clients? Because I know how I bring it in. I just talk about the bigger possibilities and the context that they live in, the reality. They've got 2 children at home, a wife that's also working or a husband that's also working. And so they got financial issues, they got job issues, and they got child rearing issues, not to mention the extended family and the world they live in. So to me, I like to acknowledge the complexity and I have suggested to some of my clients that I actually know what the solution for them is, and I will disclose that to you now. The solution is enlightenment. If you're enlightened, you can be with anything. But actually, I say nobody I know is enlightened. But everybody has the moments. But what's really at issue is being engaged in the process of becoming enlightened, which I usually frame as becoming who you are and connected to nature, but not nature, just the trees or the sky or the whales. It's true nature and the world. And so not just living in your own little shelter, your own bomb shelter, and not just being out there. I mean, in the 60s, when the student revolution was going on, it was very exciting. But at some point I recognized, what about the administrative people that they're dismissing harshly, who actually have good hearts and actually are trying to do something? There's no recognition. I mean, we still see that now. You know, you're either a right winger or a left winger or a communist or whatever, a fascist. Well, every one of us has a little communist inside, a little fascist inside, and identifying that and being conscious about it. The key thing I'm working with is consciousness, and I don't know anybody yet, and certainly not me, who was conscious every moment. And I still remember Arnie Mandel's great answer when somebody asked him about being unconscious. He says, unconscious? He says, I love being unconscious. It's fantastic. But I think what he was referring to is the dreaming state. And the Taoists believe that the dreams are part of reality that we have, and they tell us things. Trying to think of this story I heard recently. Oh yeah, the Yellow Emperor. Was very famous, and he was a great leader, but he noticed things weren't always working well. And so one night he had a dream. In the dream, he dreamed about a country where there was nobody telling anybody what to do. And he woke up and he realized he was too much of a micromanager. He needed to really back off and allow people to act according to nature. So, of course, this is very simplistic. He shifted, and he did that, according to the story, and things went a lot better. But, of course, we can't just rip all this away. The world would go crazy. I mean, look what happened in the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union fell apart, gangsters took over all kinds of things. People were starving and still are, I would say. Maybe it's better, but they're living apparently under a totalitarian regime. I think anyway, I'll stop. I want to hear what you're going to say, Richard.
Well, no, I think like what sparked something in me when you were speaking there, Abraham, was like when we think about Okay, yeah, like we all sort of share in our different ways, like an understanding of, I guess in some ways we would think of it as like society's bearing on, human subjectivity, right? And and sort of the risks of psychotherapy being something that is just like fitting people back into the system, right? But I think when you were talking about sort of the way you said it, like how I heard it was you kind of engaging people around what is unconscious in them, right? Like you sort of talked about the inner fascist, the inner communist. Like I think what you're saying is like that there is a way of engaging people around what feels excluded in them, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
repressed, like that would be another way of saying it. And that can be tremendously helpful. And that is kind of like that is one way that I would understand this project of a kind of like liberatory psychotherapy or a critical psychotherapy
Mm-hmm.
is a psychotherapy that allows space for what's excluded. Because I think that a
Yeah,
psychotherapy that reproduces like this kind of subjectivity that we're concerned about is precisely a psychotherapy that capitulates with what is excluded, right? Like
Yes.
you're not supposed to be an angry person, right? So yes, let's work
Mm.
on anger management so that you don't get angry, right? But
repress. Yeah,
this is precisely the thing that, that maintains this problem of anger, right? Then we can't have a relationship with our anger versus kind of what you're saying, which is like, how do we take ownership of the fact that inside of us is an angry person, right? Like, so
Yeah.
that really rang true for me. I loved what you said there, just about like kind of engaging with what people tend to position themselves around that should like they're sort of saying, I don't want to engage with this, right? Like, no.
and in a practical sense too, I'm often asking my clients and asking myself, where did you hear this from? Who says that you have to
Mm.
be this way? Borderline diagnosis, is that all of your identity, or are there other things? What is important to know about you? So really locating that messaging or understanding how that messaging emerged into, an over privileging, I guess, of this part of the identity, which is very narrow, very restrictive to the person. And the system can be down people's throats all the time, right? I work sometimes with different insurance companies or try to advocate for the client, maybe to actually get coverage or to, have some space between going right back to work when they're just in really poor shape. And it's often having to, the insurance companies kind of put you into this space where you have to describe the person in these really horrible kind of terms. And, as I'm working with the client around this, because they're already being labeled all the time, they may have seen a psychiatrist, I'm really trying to almost mitigate some of those common effects in society and these systems of saying, well, remember, you and we're connected. Who are you also part of your family, part of your ancestors? What do you believe about yourself? Does this resonate with you? Does it not? So I really like to talk about the messaging and its origins.
I'll tell you one thing I get about you, Richard, is I think you're exceptionally good at aligning yourself with the client without necessarily agreeing with everything,
Yeah,
but somehow they know you're with them.
I think they
I
do.
don't
I
know if,
thank you for recognizing that. Yeah, that
yeah,
has been the feedback I have gotten. Thank you.
I don't know if that's teachable. Maybe it's just a great natural talent. I'm sure we can all improve on it, but I think you're
Yeah,
very at the top level with that, right?
appreciate that.
I just wanted to say something about anger. I think
Hmm.
there's a lot of confusion about anger. People confuse it with behavior. So if I'm mad and I start yelling at somebody or breaking things or hitting them, that means I'm angry. What it means to me is the person can't stand the feelings they have and they're going to get rid of them any way they can, and you're the cause of them, or the wall is the cause of them, or I'm not going to kill you, I'll just take it out on whatever. And so the ability to actually feel the heat of anger is greatly lacking. And I've worked with people who say, well, I don't want to feel angry. And so basically, this is where my body-oriented background comes in. But I don't see any one of these methods as exclusive. They're all connected. As a person's angry, they have thoughts, they have emotions, they have history. And I think that history is important. But I suggest that what do you actually feel? I feel uncomfortable. Where do you feel it? What does it feel like? It's it's hot. And the one thing I found is very common is people don't like the heat, the feeling of the heat. And so if I can support them to feel that heat, I then describe it as that's your life energy trying to express itself, but you're trying to stop it or get rid of it. And so what we can work on is actually feeling it. Your anger, nothing wrong with it. But of course, it may be very extreme for small things. because you've been frustrated since you were too young to even know about it. So this is where you might say the historical work comes in, or the analysis, but it's not an intellectual analysis. It's a physiological, emotional, intellectual. It's holistic. And the main thing, of course, is what do you, I'll ask people, what do you feel your life energy, your life force, your spirit, whatever you call it? And most people are a bit mystified, but pretty soon people can say, oh yeah, it's kind of dampened, or I'm squashing it. I feel I can't quite breathe. And so I encourage them to work with that. I'll give you a case example. Case, I shouldn't call it. A person came to see me years ago. Guy says, I can't cry. He says, I get there, but I don't cry. And he says, no matter how hard I try, I can't let go. So I said, do you have any of that feeling right now? He says, yeah, a little bit. I said, I'd like you to do the following. Pay attention to it and try and squash it. See if you can really squash it. He cried in 30 seconds. I was quite impressed myself. But it means going with the dominant power, but internally, not, okay, that person's pissing me off, I'll shoot them. Well, it's not a good idea. Well,
Yeah,
it depends
I
on
like that distinction. I like that distinction that I haven't really heard that before, between anger and kind of its forms of expression. And you're saying, I think you're saying that like destructive behavior is actually just one way that people manage their anger, right? Like they put it into a destructive action, and that somehow makes it more containable or relatable than if they just had to sit with the angry feeling and, sort of what it represented in them,
Yeah.
which I
People are
like a
also
lot.
shamed for having anger. So they try to not have it.
Right, to get rid of it.
Yeah, doesn't work.
I think it's an active protest to have people, encourage people, or make the space for people to go into their bodies when everything in society is pushing people to some type of external fix or noise. So I love what you're saying.
Another piece that relates to this critical psychotherapy idea is we're trained to think carefully, think about it, be rational. And it's in the service of peace, you could say, but it doesn't account for the actual body surges, the physiology that's uncorked. And it doesn't account for the history that says, God, I've been squashed all my life by my parents and by my school and my religion. I got to get out of this. So there's an integrative process. So actually, question I had when you were talking about critical psychotherapy, is it a cognitive process, or is there more to it?
I wouldn't think of it as something cognitive. I wouldn't think of it as a modality of psychotherapy either, right? It's rather like a body of critiques about the way that psychotherapy is practiced, and it's like, especially in its more contemporary form. I mean, a lot of it is leveraged at these kind of cognitive only therapies, right? Like these therapies that just seek to change people's thinkings. Like Del Lowenthal has this nice way of phrasing it, which is just like therapy that tries to take people's minds off their problems, right? Like that's sort of the way he puts it,
That's
right?
a great line. I hadn't heard that one before.
Yeah. Versus like, I think what we're talking about and what we're advocates of is the kind of psychotherapy that puts people's minds onto their problems, right? Like, how do we think about our problems? How do we understand our problems? And you describe that kind of holistic understanding, which I think is really important, right? Like in an integrative way, right? Like in a way that engages the whole person. So
there's so many levels at which this can be addressed. Like if somebody tells me a problem, I ask them, what feeling do you have as you talk about this, or when you experience it? What's the body sensation? What's the emotion? And I don't tell them they have to have any of these things, but checking them. What happens to your energy? What comes up about your history? What comes up about behavior and how you do behave, should behave, could behave, shouldn't behave, all of the. So I'm looking at the whole thing. So there's a thinking part, but I'm fairly convinced that most of what drives us is not our thoughts. The thoughts come after the fact, but they make sense of it for us. But the impulse physiologically is powerful. I mean, why did children hit other children or adults? They can't control the impulse, so bam. And we teach controlling the impulse, which in a way is, it's a good idea, but it's only a beginning point. Rather than, oh, good, he's learned to stop hitting the other children. So what do we taught him? How to suppress himself. Well, it's better than walking around hitting all the other kids, but it will damage him throughout life because he's constantly biting his tongue or clenching down.
You haven't faced the core of what's going on.
Yes,
right? The
exactly.
child hasn't. Yeah. The parent is avoiding it themselves. Yeah.
Yeah. I was just thinking, like, there's this really subversive idea in that I love, Abraham, which is kind of like that there is always an irrationality in us, right? Like that we have to we have, right? Like, and this idea of excising or like eliminating our irrationality is possible and actually not really the point, right? Like that it's more about creatively engaging with or giving a space for that irrationality as it, in its, and this is where, we can get granular, like, I don't know the language that you would use around it. I don't want to say like in its best form, or like, I'm so cautious to frame our irrationality, like, or to say to idealize like an irrationality that is sort of contained or well managed, right? But like we are talking about still having a human relationship with ourselves, right? Like we're talking about being able to be angry, like in a constructive way, for instance, right? Or in a way that actually serves our being, as opposed to creating the kind of social problems that might bring us to therapy.
Totally with you.
Hmm.
I mean, part of the problem is we have huge education that anger is bad.
Hmm.
And so everybody's trying to behave well, or some people have given up and they just behave, quotes, badly. So the actual idea I think that's important is feel what you're feeling. If you feel it strongly enough, you'll learn a lot about yourself, your own history, life, people, other people, and you won't do physical harm, and you won't destroy something that shouldn't, you really don't want to destroy. But if you don't, and
Right.
then you're going to do destruction. And of course, it's happening all the time, and micro damage and macro damage. I think there's a growth that's possible where a person is in such a good state with themselves that they can accept the world, and they recognize most of what they're angry about is very small. Although if you think about personal close relationships, something happens, you get mad at your partner or they get mad at you. Well, of course, there's a whole history because we've seen that thing 1,000 times. It's one more time, I can't take it today. Stop doing that. Well, of course they might, but you haven't really achieved the main goal, which I think is connection to yourself and connection to another human being or other human beings.
I guess I want to come back to, I want to, because like so much of this space is about kind of you helping us, Abraham, engaging your own critical perspective, which, and again, I think there's so many, like you've said them so well, and there's so many critical potentials in this, like the humanistic frame, right? So we've kind of given you a sense of our, sort of like critical stance a little bit. And what about yours? Like, what, if we come back to you and what feels really important for you, or, what would be the space in psychotherapy that you would want to break down to make better, right? Like, do you have a sense of that?
Well, that's a huge question, I would say. Thank you for a huge question. And I think I've alluded, we've covered some of this in certain ways, but I'll be a bit more definitive. I think it comes down to a core value and questioning the core value. And I think the core value that I have is that we ought to look after life. People being alive matters. Now but I have asked myself, why does it matter? What difference does it make? And I don't actually have an answer to that other than the feeling that it matters. And so if life matters and in its fullest form, then what do I have to do to cultivate that? And that's everything that arises out of that core value of protecting life. And of course, protecting life under certain conditions requires a level of bravery that I'm not sure I have, to be honest. And I think I have a black belt in Aikido, but I'm not sure I can actually use it on the street, especially my physical skills are not what they used to be, but the attitude is there. So I think talking to people about these core values, like what matters to you, this is the existential part of my approach. What really matters? And tell me about what makes it matter to you. How do you know what matters? Most people don't have answers to that, but I don't mind it. In fact, I don't care if they have answers. What I'm interested in is helping them to reflect, not just on the thoughts. People have read Sartre and whoever else, Hadot, Plato and Socrates and every philosopher, but they don't. It's not the same as life. And so how does it apply to life? And so, I'm trying to encourage people to reflect, not just to think, but reflect on their whole life experience and the experience of life, and to get better and better at that so that many things will happen. They don't even have to think about it. They just already know what to do. Like the Yellow Emperor waking up and realizing his dream told him what to do. He didn't think about it or according to the story. He just did it. And so that's a hard way to live, especially in a world where people are not even thinking that way. So I think part of actually one of the things I talk to people about, and I've certainly dealt with myself, is having other people see me or have them be seen as other. You're strange. You're thinking about things in a weird way. You're not like everybody else. That's generally taken hard. But in fact, I think learning to cope with that kind of feedback that you're different, and I'll be very surprised if either of you tell me you haven't gotten that kind of feedback, then how do you become a martial artist? But not a physical martial artist, a philosophical, emotional, human martial artist that goes, how do you turn with it? Oh, okay, so you're saying that I'm weird. Yes. Okay. I can't remember if I told you this story before. When I was working with kids, well, even if I didn't, the audience hasn't heard it. There was a little boy that was extremely angry at me because I wouldn't let him do something, and I had the power in the residence to say no. He says, "Why can't I do it?" I said, "Because I don't trust you." And so he starts swearing at me and calling me names. And then he says, "What do I have to do?" I said, You have to become in a way that I can trust you." He says, "How do I do that?" I said, "I don't know. I'll know when I feel it. But in the meantime, you're not going to get to do what you say you want to do." It was amazing. His shoulders dropped. He got quiet. And I had an incredible relationship with this kid because he knew I was onto him and with him. And I forget what it was he wanted to do, but I'm quite sure he succeeded eventually getting to do it, but not fast. He wanted to know, how long will it take? I said, I don't know. It's up to you. This is part of my strategy, you could say, as a therapist. If I start to feel I've got a problem when a client is telling me something, I'm thinking, how can I give this problem back to the client in a creative way? Sometimes very hard. Like I had a client years ago, I wrote about it. I think I sent you this article that Heath and I wrote, Richard. But the client is telling me she's going to kill herself. And this comes down to the question, what's your value? What's your values? So I told her, I said, I don't know what's right for anybody. I don't know what's right for you. I can tell you I'm against what you're thinking of doing. I said, but most importantly, I feel like you're very alone with this. And I'm prepared to accompany you on the road as you contemplate this possibility. And she went like, she's, wow, it seems so real when you say all that. And she snapped out of that trance at that moment. But of course, the tendency still existed in her. But at that moment, there was a shift, which hopefully lasted for some time. So, but I think being different and being weird is, much as people say it's good, they don't like it. And so becoming different and weird is threatening. Seeing other people that way, even talking to them unconsciously, oh God, you're so strange. How do you live with yourself? This is not helpful. Tone matters a lot. I talk to people about tone. Most people don't seem to have much clue about it, but they get it eventually.
I hear this idea of the question that's rolling in my mind again, over and over again, is what is alive in you? And that varies like from moment to moment.
Yes.
But that statement to me, right, what's alive to you in your thinking, but less so thinking, more what are you feeling right now in your felt sense and relationally. So yeah.
I'm curious, Glenn, did I answer your question yet?
Percent. No, and
Okay.
I mean, I'm thinking about that too, Richard. I'm like, yeah, what Richard said, like you're in this idea of starting with and privileging the person. You're very much advocating for a psychotherapy of personhood, which I think is what is increasingly squeezed out in an effort to simplify psychotherapy. So it's a very powerful thing that you retain and advocate that position, I think. When you're asking the question, you're saying psychotherapy is primarily about discovering and understanding and elaborating on what is alive in a person.
I have, subtly or not so subtly, been criticized for being very human-oriented, person-oriented, and not taking into account the larger world, the nature, actual nature, saving the oceans and the atmosphere and all that. And for me, the starting point is in this individual human, but it's also in the collective of the humans, and people learning to see themselves within that collective, and then seeing themselves as part of that bigger collective of the sky and the mountains and the forest and the everything, and then the whole universe. I can't remember when we first talked, but I might have mentioned I have these ongoing questions. Where did everything come from? How did it get here? How is it that there was a big bang out of nothing? Surely there had to be something, but if there was something, where did that come from and how did it start? Maybe there is a God, maybe there is no such thing. So all these questions, I think, are important questions, but they're not just cognitive questions. To me, it's like the Sufis, it's a longing of the heart to know the reality as it is. And of course, the question I also have is, if I knew that reality, could I take it? Could I handle it? I mean, we see people in psychiatric wards, or I don't anymore, but you could say they're searching for the ultimate truth, but they manage to get in trouble while they're doing it and get scooped up and medicated. So, I mean, some of them, of course, need to be scooped up for their own protection. So all these big questions are in the background and some days in the foreground. Like I went out for a walk this morning, and I do that pretty much every day, and I still run a bit on occasion. And I'm just kind of in that space. I'm watching for traffic, although I almost got run over by a guy on an electric bike because he went through a red light and I was crossing and I didn't look left. Fortunately, he missed me. But I'm sure you both experience how dangerous it is to cross the street at a busy intersection. So we're kind of living in the jungle still. And I think at the same time, I have all these questions about my reactions to things as opposed to my responses. And that's what I'm working with people, but it's not separate from the bigger pictures, including the entire globe. But the truth is, I'm just one tiny little person who has a limited effect and contact with a limited number of other people in a limited part of the world. And so I can't, I'm not in charge of the war anywhere. And so sometimes I can feel guilty. I should do more. What can I do? But I can do my little bit in the world that I occupy. And often I see clients who are attempting to do more than they actually are capable of. Realistically, they can't do the things they'd like to do. And so getting it down to the right size and then moving forward. Like I used to know Kim Campbell, who was the Prime Minister of Canada for about 10 minutes. But Kim was incredibly smart, and she was very likable and engaging. And I think that, she rose way above what most of us will do. But each of us as therapists, we have a tremendous impact on a lot of people, one at a time on some occasions, or if you're working like the work you're doing, Richard, you have opportunity to impact large groups of people. So large-ish. Okay, well, I'm rambling here a bit, but
No, I mean, now I'm thinking, like, I feel like what you're saying is, it kind of, to me, it feels reminiscent of maybe something I read in Jung once. He kind of talked about the idea that one of the most responsible things we can do as people is to kind of figure out our own psyche. That and that actually has a tremendous impact. Like doing that has an effect that extends far beyond us, and that if we're primarily just focused on that extension without turning inwards, we actually don't get very far. Paradoxically, because often that is about something in us that's unprocessed that we're projecting outwards. So, that's where my mind is going when you say all of that.
I'm with you on that.
Yeah,
Actually, but here's a question that I ponder. I'll be interested in what you think or what you want to ask me about it. Some people are much better at this than others. Some people are very limited ability to look inside. It's just not a talent they have a lot of. And also, nothing that we see in education suggests to people that this is a good idea. We don't go to school and get children are now being taught mindfulness, but what for? So they won't have test anxiety and they get along better with their peers. It's all good ideas, but it's not a tool for fixing things. It's a tool, it's a method for achieving consciousness, higher, bigger, broader consciousness. I think that's been lost, or maybe it's good that I think John Kabat-Zinn, I heard him talk once, and he said, well, it may be a bit of a McDonald's, he says, but it's better than no food at all. So I thought, I agree with that.
Like in line with that, Avraham, I've sort of been thinking more about the intersection of like culture and the individual, or society and the individual. And I guess the way I'm thinking about it, like often we talk about it as like there is sort of a neoliberal ideology that is sort of instantiated into us. But then I think that it's not I don't think it's quite like that. Like I think it's bidirectional. I think it's the same people who are subject to the culture are also the ones creating it, so it's like it's not actually just this thing outside of us that gets leveraged onto us. It's also this thing inside of us that we leverage onto other people, right? Like it's something bidirectional or two-sided. And so I think I'm answering your question by saying this, but I like when you talk about how people aren't very good at this, right? I'm just thinking, but like there isn't like there like that's because these people don't they aren't afforded a kind of space to understand themselves. But I think they're also we're not afforded a kind of space to understand ourselves because understanding is hard, right? So we create a culture that avoids it, right? And so
Yes.
and it kind of becomes like a self-sustaining,
Yeah. It's the
there's
image that
the
I get is
neutrality.
like that
Yeah.
Ouroboros, that snake
Mm.
eating its own tail. That's what came to me right
Yeah.
away as both of you were speaking.
I like that analogy or image of the Ouroboros, and I always think, what would happen if it completely swallowed itself? Would it disappear? I never quite figured that out. One of the things I like to work with people is some kind of reflective process. But I believe that most people taught meditation are given instructions that they can't possibly do, and so they fail to be meditators. So, when I used to teach, I would start each class with 5 minutes of what I called quiet, but I said, you can meditate if you want. So I'd go around the room for check-in. I always did check-ins for 30, 40 minutes, actually. So it was personal time. But people would report initially, especially, I can't stop thinking. Thinking is like the devil. And I thought, so what I like to tell people is you can think, you're capable of it. What you're not able to do and what you can develop is being conscious that you're thinking. And then the goal is not just to be conscious of this and conscious of that. That's all steps on the way. In fact, in some ways, everything is steps on the way. Like I meditate, you could say daily, but how much time do I spend sitting? Not very much. Sometimes, some days, zero. But I'm out walking every morning. That is a meditation. And sometimes when I go to bed at night, I'm not falling asleep immediately. I'm like looking for where's my nature? Of course, I don't know the answer, but I'm looking for it. And so I might just be lying in bed. Okay, my nature, let's see. So I'm moving around in this sort of useless, funny way, but it's not, it's the expression of the internal it, whatever you want to call it. It's expressing and it's connecting perhaps to the bigger universality, if there is such a thing. So when I teach people, when I talk to people about this, I say there's, the idea usually is you can look at meditation or you can look at psychological inner work, and they're separate. I say they're not separate. So if I'm meditating and all of a sudden I start thinking about some person that I got to do something, that is inner work possibility. But if I try to get rid of it or dismiss it or wait for it to pass, almost surely it will pass. It might be in a minute or it might be in 3 days, but it will pass. But the thing is, the roots of it are still there and it will come back. So what I'm looking at is who is meditating, what is meditating, and what is this other person, this identity. You could say dissociated identity. We all have dissociative identity disorder, by the way. Sorry to tell you that, but it's like, who am I that is thinking about my friend or my enemy? And so then I can inhabit that person if I'm willing. And I can even inhabit my enemy and say, oh, I want to kill that Cohen person. So getting to know these pieces internally, and then the hardest part is going to the parts you don't like and becoming them, and then establishing dialogue between this part and that part. So the part that's mad at this other guy and the other guy, as I identify it internally, it doesn't have to, nobody can test if it's real about the other person, but you know what's in you. I saw a great line recently. I put it at the beginning of my last recent field note. In your imagination, you can do anything, and you can. You can imagine anything. It could be the greatest thing, the most horrible thing. I can imagine myself going off my balcony just out here and flying across to the building across the street. However, I have enough understanding that gravity has got an idea too, so I probably won't try it, but I can imagine it. And what's the point of imagining something that I can't probably do? It's expanding that consciousness, that imaginative, and dreams, possibilities, dreams, life.
I think it's very brave to take a moment to ourselves to reflect. I'm hearing elements of what I learned to be, I'm sure there's other names, but loving kindness, meditation, towards ourselves, parts, others, our enemy, and then turning that loving kindness, again, towards ourselves, to our enemy, to our friend. How would our best friend think of us? And maybe that's a way of escaping, even if it's for a moment, out of that Ouroboros snake eating itself.
Yeah.
Yeah, you make the distinction, which I think is really important and often not made, between meditation in the service of kind of processing an experience versus meditation in the service of just like making an experience go away. And they're not the same thing.
Yes.
And I think that, like, I don't know that meditation in a psychotherapy context, for instance, is always used in the way that you're suggesting it be used. I think that often meditation is seen as something that, you accept an experience and that helps it to move on, but that there's not always an emphasis upon making sense of an experience, increasingly symbolizing around it or making some kind of representation of it in order to understand it. And it's that second piece which to me distinguishes between a psychotherapy that would be in keeping with, like, that would be critical or not, basically. Like, a psychotherapy that's just in the service of making experiences move on is, again, just kind of in the service of sustaining a certain kind of experience then. And we don't want anything to interrupt that or interfere with that. Whereas this psychotherapy of understanding, this meditation of inner work, right? It opens up possibilities that maybe things would be different, right? Because you're going to engage with something and you're going to learn from it. So, I love what you said there, Avraham. I really love what you said there.
Yeah. Well, I like how you framed it also. I think the purpose of, going, when there's a so-called distraction, Arnie Mandel used to call them attractions. He can call them flirts. It says, pay attention to the flirts. There's something secret there. Actually, I'll tell you an interesting session I had. This goes back a ways. I had a woman who told me a dream, which I don't recall the dream, but she says, but there was some figure just behind somehow. She says, but I don't think it's important. I said, well, just indulge me. I said, get up from your chair, go stand where that figure is. Well, the whole process unfolded. It was a grief she had over her grandmother that she greatly loved and who had passed on. And this was a huge outpouring, but the grandmother was there, but just out of her reach because she hadn't quite felt the pain as deeply as it was in her. So I think paying attention to these things, one is it helps finish things that are unfinished, but also the more we finish these things or capture these identities that are usually called negative, the more freed up we are to sit in meditation all the time or more. So calmly, quietly. Nothing wrong with being calm and relaxed. Even, in fact, if you can be like that in the middle of a difficult situation, responses are likely to make more sense and to be more helpful. At the very least, you might survive it better.
Yeah. But that, to me, that says everything. Something came to her,
Yeah.
by inviting her to open up to what was there that she was maybe unable to see, like something came to her. And to me, that's everything. Like too often this, like our approach now is not about inviting anything. It's like about foreclosing. And so,
Yes, good way to put it. I just thought of another experience I had, which you might find interesting. I had a young guy, came from a foreign country, and he spoke, he was a particular ethnicity, but he came from a particular place where the ethnicity was was a certain group, and the language was actually different. So he was telling me, I don't want to say where, but he tells me about basically being abused as a child, physically. And so I said, well, how did you feel about that? He says, oh, I don't know. He says, it was kind of regular. All my friends were being beaten up too. That was the kind of the culture of raising children. So he tells me this story without a lot of, he's expressive, but not emotional. I said, I'd like you to tell me, do you still speak your original language? He says, oh, yeah. I said, I want you to tell me this story in the original language. He says, okay. I can do that. He said, but I'll translate for you. I said, I don't want you to translate. Just tell me the story in your language. He perhaps got about a sentence and a half or 2 sentences, burst into tears because it was all tied up in the language. And I think that even those of us who were speaking our first language, there's still language levels that are holding us in check or suppressing us.
Okay, well, I think this is maybe a good place for us to wrap up for today. I think we've covered so much territory. I'm hopeful we can have you back again at some point, Avraham, because I think that this conversation was so helpful and meaningful.
That'd be great.
Yeah, I mean, you gave us so much to think about, in terms of psychotherapy and especially in relation to sort of understanding how we might approach this in a way that, again, is more effective, more ethical, breaks from this conventional frame. Is it okay if I plug your field notes?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah. I just want our listeners to know that if you liked Avraham and you want to hear more of him, that he's got a section on his website of field notes. He writes these lovely essays and reads them out loud, and so you can listen to audio recordings or read the essays of his thoughts and about the work and the work of psychotherapy, the work of personal healing. Avraham, do you want to just share your website so listeners know how to reach you? Yeah,
I'll spell it out. It's basically my name, but in lowercase DRAVRAHAMCOHEN.com. And can I say my email address too?
Sure. Or I think, is it on your website?
It is.
Yeah. So then the listeners can go to drabrahamcohen.com and you can find if you want to connect.
Yeah. And I'm interested in people that are interested in being interested in themselves, and also therapists that are looking to expand their horizons in ways they think I might be able to contribute to them doing that.
And you offer private supervision. Do you do psychotherapy still too?
Yep, both.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. So if anyone's
3.5 days a week, Sunday mornings, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday.
If anyone wants to work with Dr. Cohen, you go to his website, either personally or professionally, and you can find him there. Avraham, thank you so much for joining us today. This was just really special. So we appreciate having you here.
Wow. Yeah, thank you for giving of yourself so much today.
Well, thanks for inviting me, and you're welcome. And it's been a treat talking to both of you, and hopefully to many other people.
All right.
Okay.
We hope you enjoyed the podcast and are a little wiser for it.
Thanks for listening.